Thank you so much, Emma. Super honored to be here as part of the opening keynote for this fabulous event. As Emma shared, I have a little bit of content that I would love to sort of walk you through as we think about my career journey that I'm going to share with you, as I've had the fortunate experiences to be a COO, Chief Data Officer, and a CTO. So I would love to share a little bit with you of how and what I learned in each of those roles and how they tie together, particularly as we see the evolution in the C-suite and the CTO roles occurring. As Emma mentioned, there'll be plenty of time for Q&A, so feel free to drop things into the chat, and I would love to have an open dialogue with you at the end. So with that, maybe let me walk you through my career path. Um, it's a little eclectic. So I did actually start my education and formal education at university, studying computer engineering. I'm going to date myself a little bit and sort of share with you at that time, AI was more random number generators, and my languages were COBOL and Fortran. So it's been a long time since I entered into sort of that field of study. But there were some financial limitations for me completing my university, so I didn't actually finish my undergraduate studies. I ended up enlisting in the United States Army. There, I had the opportunity to work on the Apache helicopters. It was sort of the latest technology that existed across the U.S. military, as this was the first version of the Apache that had things like heads-up displays. And so I was really fortunate to get an opportunity to work on the weapons and electrical systems. Again, sort of playing on the fact that I really enjoyed technology. I enjoyed troubleshooting. I enjoyed sort of fixing and solving problems. And this was a way for me to do it in the military and sort of take that forward. Part of the problem is, as you get ready to get out of the military, is very few people have Apache helicopters sitting in their backyards where they're looking for the weapon systems to be repaired. So I needed to figure out, how do I convert that military experience into the civilian world? And that led me to hardware repair. So computers at that time were really becoming prevalent across consumer space. Everybody was buying computers and having them on their desktops, but that also sort of opened the opportunity for these repair facilities to open up to fix things like your printer, your sound card, failing motherboards, all of that space. And so I was very fortunate that a prior service vet hired me into that role, despite the fact that I had no experience. I got my A+ certification and started doing that for several years. It was wonderful, but I did realize that there was going to be a limitation to how far you could go in hardware. If you think about the hardware evolution, this was pre-cloud, but things were still early networking, early connectivity, but there was very little innovation that was happening in the hardware space. Innovation was happening in software. And so I attended a night school program for my Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer certification, and passed that, and then was very, very blessed with the opportunity to actually get a job at Microsoft. This was in the late 90s, and so my first role was actually supporting Internet Explorer 5 on Windows 3.1. So again, I feel like I'm dating myself quite a bit, but it was a fabulous sort of opportunity to really understand the consumer space and how people were using software in that space. I decided I wanted to get into the enterprise space because Microsoft was one of the few software companies at that time that was really thinking about large enterprise customers and businesses, and how are we going to leverage software to support those types of organizations. And so I took on a role supporting the automotive vertical. First, I was based out of Redmond, Washington, then moved to Detroit to take on one of the big three auto manufacturers out of there. But it was really sort of being the technical liaison between the business and Microsoft technical support. So how do you take a technology problem and translate it into a business use case to support investment of resources, roadmaps, change to product, et cetera. That was all very wonderful, but I started to realize I was hitting the ceiling in what I wanted out of my career. And so I leveraged the benefits that Microsoft had and attended law school on the weekend. I was really sort of adamant that I was going to stay at Microsoft and become a lawyer. We were coming out of antitrust. There was lots of things going on in the legal field. And I felt like that technology background of being able to troubleshoot and think linearly could be applied to law school. It was really super beneficial for me, but what I found was that Microsoft didn't have an opportunity to do a transition that was quite that simple. And so what they suggested is that I leave Microsoft and come back after practicing for 5 years. I had already been at the company for about 10, and so that wasn't really an option. So I started looking back on the technology side. How could I get deeper in technology within the company? And so at this time, the cloud was just starting to come out. We had Business Productivity Office Suite, which was the early modern work platform. And we were really trying to figure out how do we sell to C-suite at an organization the value of the cloud and the benefit of the cloud. And that was great, but similar to many startups, that startup within Microsoft lasted for about 9 or 10 months and then was acquired and absorbed. So this is where I first landed in the data space. Which was really, really sort of interesting. This was the transition in the CEO of Microsoft. This was during our transition from Steve Ballmer to Satya, and there was a lot of focus internal to the organization about transforming Microsoft. How are we going to become a data-driven company? How are we going to leverage data to make business decisions? And this is where the lines for me really started to blur between business and technology. There was something about that translation layer of being able to translate a technical solution to solve a business problem. And how do you make sure that you have the right technology or the right solution? And for us at Microsoft, were we doing that based on data? Were we actually leveraging insights being provided by customers and partners to think about a product roadmap or a licensing model or a go-to-market strategy? And so that was just a great opportunity to really start to think about the data space. And I then entered into the office of the CTO, which is more about the technical platform. If you think about the evolution of data at this time, is really the explosion, and organizations were starting to think about blockchain and how do we think about trusted ledger. Microsoft has a fabulous data portfolio of services from on-prem to the cloud, open source, all the way from ingestion to visualization. And how do you tie all of that together to solve for business problems for your supply chain as you think of from farm to manufacturing to retailer to consumer? And so lots of opportunity again to translate that technology. Fortunately, based on all of these experiences, I was actually able to land my first C-suite role internal to Microsoft. And this was really as the Chief Operating Officer for Azure Data Engineering organization. And I'll deep dive into these C-suites in just a minute. But to sort of give you context, this was the first time I had entered into the C-suite and really sort of how do I take those experiences of translation between business and technology to actually implement business change across the organization. I did that for multiple years and then had the opportunity to take on the Chief Data Officer role for Microsoft UK. So I am, despite the accent, based in London. I did that for several years. And then about 4 months ago, I left Microsoft to take on the field CTO role responsible for Europe, Middle East, and Africa here at Databricks. So what I would love to do is as you think about the relationships you have with C-suites and as you're thinking about your own career path and how do you build and evolve, I would love to share with you these last three roles that I've had within the C-suite and sort of the similarities and the things that I learned in each of those functions that's helped me. The first one is that Chief Operating Officer role. And so again, this was for the Azure Data Engineering organization within Microsoft. We were getting ready to go through exponential growth so from several hundred engineers to several thousand engineers. It was a multiple billion-dollar business with global distribution. So primarily based out of Redmond, but we also had major locations and development centers across Serbia, China, India, so some of the big sort of organizations. And I worked directly with the corporate vice president of Azure Data Engineering and really helped him think about how do we leverage data to drive our business differently? So how are we looking at resource allocation? How are we looking at organizational strategy? How are we looking at where we would make investments across the product portfolio and all of the planning that goes into that? We operated on, because we were primarily cloud-based, we had 6-month development cycles. And so how do we make sure that we're integrating all of our planning based on that 6 months and then the next 6-month cycle that would come up? This was particularly interesting because historically our engineering cycles had been 3 years for on-premises products. And so the organization itself was going through this transformation of how do we become more agile? How do we actually develop our roadmaps to be responsive to things like customer inputs on a much quicker basis to be able to deliver against those things? And so there were three sort of principles or lessons that I really learned in that role that were beneficial. The first was make sure that your strategy is based on principles. Too often, I think I found in smaller organizations, particularly coming in, where hallway conversations was where decisions were made. And so it was really difficult to have a structure when you're looking to be a data-driven business, to have that rigor around why decisions were being made and ensure that the organization understood the logic that was going behind it, and why the data was being interpreted or leveraged, how they could actually make sure that there was quality data going into the system so there was accurate representation of their business. And so by making sure that everyone across the organization was aware of these are the principles that we're leveraging to make the decisions around headcount allocation or budget allocation was super beneficial when we were trying to do that transformation. The other thing is, the other lesson I learned was really around people, process, and technology. I know people have been saying that for a long, long time, but I really think um, it's grounded in truth, right? A lot of times we get caught up in technology. I worked at a technology company. I've been in the technology space for a long, long time. It's really easy to think about what technology exists that's going to solve a specific problem for me. And we overlook the changes that need to happen in the people and the process, right? People are, by their very nature, they enjoy doing tasks the way they've done them in the past. And so really thinking about what is the impact of making a decision or driving a technology or implementing a solution, what impact is that going to have on the people? And then how can we think about changing the process or the way that they do something? This is really becoming more of an evolution every day as we think of organizations that I talk to every day today, that are constantly asking, how can I become a technology company? How can I become an AI company? How do I become a data company? With all of those organizations, they immediately want to talk almost always about technology and what is the platform and what are the tools and how do they solve for this governance issue or this ingestion issue. But we do often have to take a step back and say, okay, how are you going to think about the people? How do you think about ensuring that once you build that technology platform, people will actually use it? And is there something that you can change around their processes? Can you build community? How do we think about sort of driving those things? And with that comes change management. I think we've all seen digital transformation being talked about for several decades at this point. And so making sure that you're applying those best practices around change management, because just because we build a tech platform and it's the best tool that we think is available to be able to solve those business problems, it does take that level of communication and structure and change processes to go into place to get the organization to actually come leverage against those tools. And it's no difference whether you're in a technology company or a non-technology company. From my perspective, those three things are all super critical as you're thinking about digital transformation. As I was wrapping up that role as the chief operating officer in the Azure Data Engineering organization, I received a phone call from the Microsoft UK subsidiary that they were looking for a chief data officer. This was the first subsidiary in the world that was creating this function within country, and they were really looking for somebody to focus internally. So all of those things that I talked about Microsoft's transformation and trying to become data driven, the UK was one of the first subsidiaries to really say, how can we change as a subsidiary when we think about things like services or sales or delivery or customer success or all of these attributes we have across the business? How do we make sure that data is forefront in the conversations that we're having internally? How do we get grounded on the right data assets and data attributes to be able to drive the business even faster and grow even more? So a big portion of my role was really functionally grounded on how can I ensure that Microsoft UK was leveraging data internally. But the other thing was I had lots of opportunity to speak to external customers who were also looking to transform the way they did business and were looking to Microsoft as a best practice or an example, or were there lessons learned as we were going through our transformation that they could benefit from. And so it was a great opportunity, but again, I would say that role was also grounded in those same three lessons. As I was looking to change the way, for example, sales. The sales team was looking to approach their customer interactions or enter quality data into the tools so that we had clear line of sight into the pipeline so that we could allocate resources appropriately across the Azure services, really becoming very, very principled on how are we going to look at the data? How are we going to use the data? How are we thinking about things from sales compensation plans to rewards to allocation of the resources to specific sales teams, depending on where the opportunity was or where customers needed the most help. And so making sure that across the UK subsidiary, everybody, had representation within that construct to be able to drive and create and give feedback around those principles that we were creating. And so really creating internal governance structures that allowed you to be principle based with representation and voice across each of the business groups that existed within the subsidiary. The other thing, again, is to continue to focus on the people and process. Because I was the chief data officer at Microsoft, I actually made zero technology or platform decisions. The platform was actually the Microsoft platform. And so it was provided from Microsoft IT. The dashboards and the tools and the implementation were all delivered by the Microsoft IT. And so I really focused on the people and the process and how do you drive the business differently. And then as a stakeholder into MSIT, how do I make sure that my business objectives and my business needs were being articulated into the technology platform to be able to deliver. And a majority of my function and role really was focused on that change management. How do you take an organization that's been around for multiple decades and that has done their job in a certain way or a certain function, and how do you ensure that we can create the capabilities for us to drive change as well as ensure that it's a consistent feedback loop so that the business could constantly give feedback on as we're going through this transformation, as we're becoming more data driven, how can they actually influence and give feedback on what was working and what wasn't working in the new technology platform that was being set up by IT and the processes that we were trying to land and deliver. And so keeping in mind that change management cycle and process as we went through that transition was very helpful. And after having done that for several years, I realized I was hitting, 24 years or 23 years at Microsoft. And I realized I had never had exposure outside of the organization. I was very focused on the data and the data platform and data strategy and data culture. And so as I looked across the ecosystem, I was super excited to be given the opportunity to join my current company, which is Databricks. Databricks is going through exponential growth, and so they created a new part of the organization that was really this field CTO function. The role is primarily focused externally to support organizations as they're going on their data transformation. And so thinking about everything that you have to think about as you go through that. So what is your data strategy? How are you thinking about the culture? What does the technical platform and architecture look like? And the team is 4 people globally. And so can we leverage our experiences of real world implementation and bring it to bear with the technology that Databricks has to offer? And so still relatively new into the role since it's only been for about 4 months. But so far in the conversations I'm having with customers, I continue to see those three lessons come to bear in every conversation that I'm having. So as organizations are trying to think about, we've built this data platform, yet we can't get anybody across the organization to use it or leverage it. And so taking them back to these foundations around what are the principles that your C-suite is leveraging as you think about the changes that you're trying to implement across your organization? Are you taking into account not just the technology platform that you're leveraging, but also the people and process? So as you can see, over the years, I've had multiple sort of C-suite roles, but all of them foundationally have come down to the same skills and the same competency around how do you leverage technology in a way that allows you to transform an organization or to change an organization. And all of them have that common foundation of being able to translate business into technology. So as you think about your role or your stakeholders that you're working with, really that is the benefit that you can bring as a CTO when you understand the technology really deep. Now, how do you think about not just translating technology into features and functions conversation with your CFO or your CMO, but how do you translate that into business value? Really, even in conversations I'm having lately around the economic recession that we see coming, many business stakeholders within the organization don't care about the technology and the engineering work that we're bringing with new products and new features and new functions. What they care about is it going to make me more efficient? Can I drive savings? Can I create new revenue streams? And so, as product leaders or technology leaders, we really need to think about how do we empower the business to understand the power of technology to help them solve sort of those business problems. And so I'll close with just sort of the this great quote that I found from Pearl Zhu. Innovation happens at the intersection of people, process, technology, customers, and the business ecosystem. And each of the C-suites, whether you're in that function or they're your stakeholder, are really trying to bring those things together for the value of your customers and for the business. And so with that, I'll thank you very much for your time and for listening to me, and pass it over to Emma so that we might be able to answer any questions that have come up during the conversation.
Cool. Thanks, Robin. That was really interesting. I was a bit hooked on that not everybody has an Apache hanging around as well, which was, I don't think I got past that to start with.
It might
There
be the
are a couple
exception.
no, my husband would love one. I'd just say that as well, though. So, but no, I think you're right. Not everyone has one hanging around. There are a couple of questions that have come in. Let's start with out my glasses, so it's hard to see. Okay, that's just gone off. I want to ask, just while we're seeing some questions come up and see if anything else comes in. Really interested. There's so much experience you've got there, and what a journey that's been through. Looking back, I guess, at how you've transitioned through those roles and how you've sort of made that progression through, what advice would you give yourself then, looking back, or what advice would you give your younger self as you were starting out then now?
Yeah, I think the big one that I get asked a lot about is around imposter syndrome. I think that the first time you hit sort of that C-suite in any sort of C title, there is some level of imposter. There is sort of this level of, am I doing the right thing? Can I really help the business drive as fast as they want to? Do I have the right knowledge and skills and capabilities? So I think for me, it's I wish I could tell myself, be more confident. Like, they hired
Right.
you for this role, or they hired me for those roles because of the experience I brought. It was really interesting doing this transition to Databricks because I hadn't had to do a real deep interview for more than 2 decades. I had definitely done interviews for each of those roles internal to Microsoft, but when I came to Databricks and I started onboarding, it was really interesting. They were like, "Here, write this SQL query to go gather data out of this." I was like, "Oh my gosh!" The last time I used a language was like Fortran, right? Or COBOL or Ada. Like, it's nowhere. I've had plenty of teams that have written fabulous SQL code, but I never had to sort of do that. And so I think for just a glimmer, there was like, oh my goodness, what have I done? Like, what have I gotten myself into? And so just having confidence that there are strengths and attributes and skills that you bring to each of those roles, and you're building on those for each of them. And so have confidence that they hired you for the reason and that you can deliver that value.
Yeah, it's always a balance, isn't it? You want to push yourself out of your comfort zone, but it's kind of knowing your own strength rather than confidence rather than being overconfident, I guess is the balance to that. So yeah, where do you think you've learned your biggest lessons then through all of that?
Yeah, I think exactly like you said. So as I mentioned, I've always sort of had this balance between work experience and things like formal education or external opportunities. If you think about
Mm.
it, I mean, I went to law school. I did a engineering certification program at Stanford. Like I always try to think about how can I push myself a little further, and if I'm not being challenged in this job, are there other things outside the ecosystem? So building on communities like CTO Craft, how do you get involved in things like mentoring? How do you take advantage of education? How do you sort of learn that new skill and attribute? The interesting part about technology is it evolves so fast, right? And so we're all in this interesting space of there's no way that you can know it all. And so really thinking about what do you want to specialize in? How do you make sure that you stay up to date on that? And then how do you make sure that you're keeping yourself challenged and refreshed to continue to bring those perspectives in?
Mm. On that, and I guess that kind of that self-reflection and taking stock on that, one of the questions that's coming from Iman says, do you have any checkpoint questions? I guess the stuff that you're really asking yourself. Like I do as well, actually do a bit of a retrospective with myself at the end of a day or a week or a month of like, okay, what have I really learned today? What do I wish I'd done differently? How is it really going? How do I assess my own performance for myself? Bit of journaling, a bit of a retrospective. Do you do that for yourself as well? And is it something that you would recommend?
I do on a weekly basis. I'll try to think about what did I actually achieve this week? Where were my biggest blockers? What are the things I need to
Mhm.
think about next week? Right? Are they systemic? Are they capability? Are they just to make sure that I have a grounding in sort of that? I try not to go into the, oh my gosh, did I make the right decision to take this job? Right? I try not to rat hole myself in that
Yeah. Let's take that as a
more than
given.
once. Right, more than once a month or once a quarter to really say, am I making the impact that I thought I was going to have? Am I being challenged in the way that I wanted to be challenged? And am I growing skills and competencies that I wanted to develop? Right. And so I try to take stock of those things on more of a monthly basis just to make sure that I'm aligned with my leadership, that I'm driving the right things, and that if I feel like there's a disconnect between what the business is asking of me and what I am looking to deliver to the business, it gives me a good opportunity to bring that up in my one-on-ones with the global CTO or with the senior vice president of field engineering, which is where I report up through, to really have those candid conversations of this is why you've hired me. These are the skills and competencies. Here's where I think there might not be alignment, or where there is alignment, and how do we build on that and build the transformation that you're looking to drive across the organization.
Mm. That's really taking charge of your own growth as well, though, isn't it? So you're asking those questions of yourself and having those conversations with other people. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think
There's
if
a
you
few.
look at early in my career, I did stay in that same job for 10 years because I didn't know how to do that. I think it is a skill that you have to sort of build and grow and develop and get comfortable
Mm.
in being uncomfortable. And so just know that everybody is uncomfortable having those types of conversations, but it does in from my experience, it exponentially opens up opportunities and career paths when you're okay having those types of discussions, because the first half of my career was really stagnant, stayed in the same one or two jobs for that first 12 or 13 years, because I didn't want to have those conversations with myself or with my leadership.
Mm. Cool. There are a few questions coming in. Plenty of people looking for tips and tricks and things. Louise asks, do you have any top tips on how to go about defining strategic principles?
Yeah, that one's really interesting. I think it depends on the scope of the role. So when I was the COO function, it was really interesting because I was more about implementation, and so it was I don't want to say a dictatorship, but it was more of a top-down led model. So making sure that it was really aligned with the corporate vice president and what was his strategy. He was ultimately the CEO for that business and was being held accountable, and so making sure that the principles were aligned with what he was looking to drive for the organization, what were the outcomes he was being held accountable for, how do we make sure that everything's aligned with that. When I took on the chief data officer role for Microsoft UK, that was much more principle by committee, right? I had to definitely get business stakeholders across the organization to come together. We created a governing body that had senior leadership representation across each of the major business group pillars to come together early on to say, as we think about our strategy, these are the top three principles that we're going to ground our decision and our strategy and our direction and implementation in. And so it sort of depends on the organization and the role that you're looking to fulfill. But I've seen it done both ways, where it would definitely a top down outline of what the principles are, and others that I think is a little harder actually when you have, especially when you have six business groups that you're trying to get everybody to align. And so just make sure that you abstract it to the principles, not the actual implementation, because everybody loves to get caught up in the details of how as opposed to the what. Like, right, why are we doing what we're doing, and what are we looking to accomplish?
Mm. It's I've seen that quite a few times with clients of like trying to just align on the half a dozen things as opposed to the 50 or so things that they're trying to get done across an organization, which does kind of lead on to another question here that we have from Chris. It talks about what tools or techniques have you used to prioritize those competing interests within an organization? Does it come down to the expected bottom line? So yeah, I'm thinking particularly of the clients where I've had where we had a client once where all of their OKRs, their objectives, all the things that they were planning to get done were kind of bottom up and like, okay, what is everybody doing now? How do we align that to what we're doing as a business? And we tried
Yeah.
very hard to get everyone into the room and say, actually, let's do this the other way around, or at least as well as, so that we can say, what are the things we really want to get done? And then the stuff that you're doing should at least be in service of those things. And that was quite a day to try and get everybody to agree. So what kind of tools and techniques then can you offer people advice on that?
Yeah, so it's always interesting for me. We always started with the financial statement, right? If you think about what are the top business objectives you're looking to deliver, this is essentially what the organization has committed to shareholders and stockholders that they're going to deliver. And you'll notice these days that it's not just about driving operational efficiencies or, the increasing of customer experience, but you're starting to see things like environmental, right, ESG goals going into these financial statements. And so for me, taking the organization on the journey to say, okay, what is our ultimate? It's revenue's a piece of it, but there's also other aspects to it of, customer sentiment, organizational, the operational sort of components of it. And so grounding on those pillars, like you said. And so now we have our OKRs coming from the bottom, which are really, really granular and typically very, very specific on an attribute or a feature or function within.
Yeah.
And how do I make sure that each one of those is going to drive toward the big picture? And so mapping those out. And if we can't map it out, and we can't as a collective come to the decision of where there's an alignment there, then it's not something that we should prioritize or pursue right now. The other thing is making sure that we don't come into the OKR, the KPI stagnation, right? Like I'm always surprised when organizations create 100 KPIs. There's no way that anybody is going to focus on 100 KPIs, right? I can't believe how many times we would push down to the engineering teams like, right, here's 100 KPIs on, optimization and performance and, quality and all of these things, which is wonderful. But then they were constantly chasing whichever OKR was the most red, right, on the
Yeah.
scorecard. And so that's not really sort of driving the culture or the implementation or the changes that we're looking to see. So making sure that they're really, really narrowed and focused, and that they're achievable, but at the same time, they're not so granular that they just become where you're having to hire whole teams to chase down KPIs. That's not driving value for the business either.
Mm. And what about specific then into technology from that angle as well? Because there are plenty of technology teams and organizations within a wider business that are literally trying to balance competing priorities and different needs from different areas of businesses every day. How do you, does it really come down to, like you say, that starting with that financial statement still?
I think so, right? Right. I think
Yeah.
it really comes down to when you're starting to have a conversation with your C-suite counterparts across the organization, and you outline the 100 requests that they have put into the right for the platform or the technology to be able that your engineers are trying to solve for. There has to be a prioritization. You can't deliver all of them,
Hmm.
right? And so there has to be some level of a roadmap. And so getting them to collectively come together, this is why I feel like, despite the fact that people would say law school was a waste of 3 years, I would have to say I have definitely used some of the negotiation tactics I learned in law school on how do you bring both parties to the table? How do you understand that there's a give and take? How do you get them to collectively agree on which one is prioritization for the organization and not just their group or their function? And can you reasonably create a mediation that allows you to defer one in the timeline or reprioritize and I would say 90% of the time that works. And for the 10% it doesn't, then you just sort of need to take a position based on all the data and insight and knowledge and understanding that you have of the technology and the platform and what the business can deliver and what you think you can be most successful, and yeah, make the hard decisions.
That's a bunch of skills that are quite often overlooked or at least undervalued, probably, in terms of like mediation and negotiation and advocacy and how to have those conversations. That's a skill in its own right. You touched on there as well around sometimes you at some point maybe you just have to root yourself in what the data is, knowing your own data and how to base those decisions from. One of the questions here is from Charlie, who says, how do you inspire people to engage with and collaborate around insights from data? Which I guess inspiring others is another of those sort of underrated and undervalued skills sometimes. So how do you get people excited about that kind of insight and data in the same way that maybe you do?
There's a couple of approaches. I mean, we definitely took a look at things like how do we make rewards and recognition based on data, right, really early in the process when we were looking to drive quality data into the system. And so by making sure that we created things that would get people excited about looking at the data, making sure that it was good quality, making sure they were putting right data, that the correct data into the systems. And so there's some around building processes and support. I think there's another thing about one of the advantages I think that Microsoft had as they went through that transformation was we had this amazing new CEO that came in and said, we are going to transform as a business and we're going to be data driven to do that. So, right, we're going to change the Microsoft culture. We're going to really figure out how we use this and having leadership ask questions about, well, where's the data to support that decision or why, right? Help me show me why you made that decision and rationally, provide the backup. And so it was sort of a top down
Excellent.
approach and capability that we had. But we also had some amazing champions within the business. So you're right, engineers struggling to get their day job, and is there a way that they could use data to automate a piece of the process, and how much of an investment would it take to create that broader and scale that across the entire organization? And so making sure that you recognized those efforts and that work and create recognition programs for them to be celebrated, and creating data driven solutions as more grassroots activities. And I think you need both, and you need to communicate both. multiple ways and multiple avenues, and making sure that everybody sort of sees that data is central into how the business is being run and how you're delivering success. And it's not just reports and backward looking, but it's truly innovation and creativity and automation and all of those amazing things that can come out when you think about transforming using data.
And it's really the thing that then drives those decisions going forward. I guess it's one of the things we come across all the time, same with any kind of transformation or change in the culture, in the way that you have conversations in an organization, is you can't do it on your own. So having that kind of advocacy around the business, and especially from your CEO, must be really a key to driving any kind of change like that. Mm.
Absolutely.
Another point here, we've got just a few minutes left. We've got time for a couple more questions. Anybody else that wants to add questions in, do so. If we can't get to all of them today, I think Andy has said we'll make sure that they are passed on, and we'll try and keep answers coming for you post the conference. But from Rogier, who says, C-level can be lonely. Where do you get your inspiration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually, and the interesting part for me was after leaving Microsoft, which is a big organization where there's lots of sort of female leadership across the organization. It's been really interesting coming into Databricks, where there's less people and there's less sort of people at that level and able to have that conversation. I have a and so I started thinking outside. How do you leverage things like CTO craft? How do you leverage, communities and organizations that can oftentimes be that neutral sounding board or the neutral third party for you to bring some of those issues and questions, particularly if you don't have it within the organization. I mean, I have definitely a strong team, definitely support from the global CTO as we're looking to sort of drive these things. But there are definitely times where it's like, okay, am I just crazy, or is this right? Is this just how this organization operates compared to my other one? And just looking for someone outside the organization to have sort of those neutral third party. And so get connected into communities that you have something in common with, whether it's by role, by gender, by interest, by function, by industry, whatever it might be, because those relationships and those networks definitely come in, are very helpful as you think about how do I build up that ecosystem that I can leverage when it is difficult. You can't have some conversations with your directs or your teams, and so how do you have that sounding board outside of your organization and your construct?
Mhm. On that, are there any recommendations? Obviously, CTO Craft, and I recommend it to people
Mhm.
all the time. Of all the Slack groups and communities that I'm a part of, it's one of the most active. Having said that, I'm also part of Chief of Staff groups, like you say, based on your job function. I've just joined Chief in the UK, so other women leaders around as well. So you want different things from different groups. Who are some of the groups then and communities that you might recommend too?
Yeah, so the ones that I have joined are CTO Craft. I have Women in Data, which is a fabulous one. If you're looking, they have varying levels of females in at every role and function that you can think of in the data space. I just completed my chief interview as well, so looking for that
Excellent.
gender
I shall see
sort
you
of
there.
connection. On right, and so yeah, I have some connections out of the US as well that I continue to leverage out of Microsoft. And so be careful not to become overwhelmed. Make sure that there's sort of a point. I have to admit that it you can join a lot of different organizations, but I sort of feel like if I'm not actively engaged, or I'm not learning, or I'm not contributing, then is it really a community that you want to stay connected
Yeah.
to? So your time is very valuable, so make sure you're prioritizing those communities that you connect to, that you get value, and that you feel like you're contributing what you want to contribute to the organization as well.
Cool. The one question that's up there that we didn't get a chance to, and we have run out of time now, was around any recommendations for books or reading around change management. So if you've got something quick to add, jump on it. Otherwise, I'm sure plenty of people will jump on the chat and add that to it as well. Robin, I think you've got a flight to go and get, haven't you? Do we need to let you jump too?
I do, but always default to the Big Hairball is a great book on change management. It's one of my favorites. So
Awesome. Thank you.
okay,
Thank you very much for your time, Robin. Thank you.
thank you.